The fog over the river was thick, like a white shroud, covering the banks in a ghostly haze. Silas Vance, sitting in his old wooden boat, slowly rowed, savoring the morning silence. At 64, he still found solace in these dawn fishing trips, when the world around him stood still, leaving him alone with the river and his thoughts. In moments like this, he remembered his youth, how he and Lorelei, then his young fiancée, came to this small town after his service, how they built their cabin, and how they dreamed of children that fate never granted them. The river had seemed boundless then, and life endless. Now the banks seemed closer, but the water still beckoned him with its quiet strength. Cy adjusted his old field jacket, smelling of pine and smoke from their wood stove, and glanced at his rod. There were no bites today, but that didn't bother him. He came here not only for the fish, but for the peace. Lorelei, he knew, must be awake now, bustling in the kitchen, making breakfast. He smiled, imagining her humming as she rolled out the dough for pancakes. Their life was simple, but warm, like a sunbeam on a crisp September day. Suddenly, a thin, desperate cry ripped through the silence. Cy froze, the oars still in his hands. The sound was strange, not a bird, not a human, but a whimper, almost childlike. He squinted, peering into the mist, but saw nothing. The cry came again, and there was so much helplessness in it that the old man's heart clenched as if struck by sudden pain. "Someone's in trouble," he muttered, laying the oars down and listening intently. The sound came from the middle of the river, where the current was particularly strong. Cy strained his eyes, trying to make out anything in the gray veil. And then he saw it. About 30 yards from the boat, something was struggling in the water, frantically fighting the current. It was small, dark, and almost blending in with the river. He cupped his hand over his eyes, trying to understand what it was. "That's a kitten!" he gasped, putting aside his fishing rod. The tiny creature was desperately paddling, but its strength was clearly failing. The current pulled it farther, and it weakened with every passing moment. Cy didn't hesitate. He leaned hard on the oars. In his 40 years living in the country, he had seen all sorts of things: drowning puppies, lost calves, and even a young deer stuck in the marsh. But he couldn't abandon a living creature in distress. It was against his nature. "Hold on, little guy, hold on," he encouraged, rowing with all his might. The boat glided over the water, slicing through the fog. The kitten had almost disappeared beneath the surface when Cy reached it. He leaned over the side, feeling the cold water touch his fingers, and scooped the small body up in one swift motion. It was light, soaking wet, trembling, but alive. Cy pressed it against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat. "There you go, I got you," he said, smiling. "Alive, and that's all that matters." He carefully wrapped the foundling in his field jacket, trying to warm it. The kitten lay in the bottom of the boat, breathing heavily. Its tiny paws weakly twitched. Cy stroked it, feeling the fur matted with water. "Where did you come from, you poor thing?" he murmured. "Did you fall off the bank?" But even in this miserable state, something about the little creature struck him as odd. Its paws seemed wider than a normal kitten's. The claws were stronger, and its ears, he thought, had tiny tufts on the tips. Cy frowned, examining his rescue. The kitten's large golden eyes opened and looked at him with such depth that he instinctively drew back. "You're a strange one," he muttered, shaking his head. "Maybe you're not a kitten at all." The fog began to lift, revealing the tree-lined banks. Cy steered the boat toward home, still glancing at the creature. It was no longer trembling as violently, but looked at him with such gratitude that the old man's heart stirred. He didn't know what this foundling was, but one thing was clear: he couldn't leave it alone. "Laurie will be surprised, of course," he said, smiling. "But we'll figure something out, right?" The kitten quietly peeped, as if agreeing, and Cy felt a warmth spread in his chest. He didn't know what awaited them, but in this moment, with the small creature in his hands, he was sure this meeting on the river wasn't a coincidence. It was the beginning of something new, something that could change their quiet lives. The boat gently nudged the bank, and Silas, holding the wrapped bundle, stepped out onto the grass. The fog had almost completely lifted, and the river now sparkled under the morning sun like a mirror. He looked at the small bundle in his jacket. The little one was no longer shaking as much, but was still weak. Its golden eyes, open for a moment, looked at Cy with an inexplicable depth, as if it were not just an animal, but a creature who understood more than it seemed. "Well, buddy," Cy said quietly, stroking the damp fur, "let's head home, and we'll figure out who you are there." The walk home took about 15 minutes. Cy walked carefully, holding the bundle close to his chest so as not to disturb the baby. His thoughts were confused. He had held many kittens in his hands. The neighbors' cats often had litters, and he had nursed many weak or abandoned ones back to health, but this one was different. The paws seemed too wide, the claws were sturdy, and the ears, with those barely noticeable tufts, gave him strange ideas. He remembered the old hunters' stories about the bobcats that sometimes roamed the nearby woods. Could this be a bobcat kitten? But how did it end up in the river? Alone and helpless? "Lord," he mumbled, shaking his head, "if you're a bobcat, what am I going to do with you?" He imagined Lorelei, his Laurie, seeing this creature. She had always loved animals. Their old dog, Duke, who died 5 years ago, was almost a son to her. But a wild animal was something else entirely. She wouldn't be scared, of course, but she would certainly be surprised. Cy chuckled, thinking how she would grumble and then, most likely, start fussing over it like a mother hen. Approaching the house, he stopped at the porch. Their wooden home, built in their younger years, stood on the edge of town, surrounded by apple trees and rows of garden herbs. A faint wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. Laurie had already started the wood stove. Cy took a deep breath, gathering himself, and stepped inside. "Laurie, I'm home," he called out, carefully closing the door. The sound of dishes clattering came from the kitchen, and then his wife's voice, warm like morning coffee. "Cy, where have you been? The pancakes are getting cold." She came into the hallway, wiping her hands on a towel, and stopped short, seeing the bundle in his arms. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "What treasure did you bring home this time?" she asked, approaching. Cy carefully unwrapped the jacket, showing the little creature. It lay quietly, but its eyes were now wide open, looking at Laurie with curiosity. She gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "A kitten?" she asked, bending down. "The poor thing, it's soaked. Where did you find it?" "In the river," Cy replied, sinking into a chair. "It was floating, crying out, almost drowned. I barely got to it in time." Laurie sat beside him, gently reaching out and stroking the baby. It didn't flinch, just let out a weak peep, as if complaining. Her face softened, but Cy noticed her frown as she looked closer. "Cy," she said quietly, "are you sure this is a kitten?" He nodded, but there was no conviction in his voice. "I thought so at first, too, but look at him. The paws, the ears, those tufts. Laurie, I think it might be a bobcat kitten." Laurie froze. Her eyes widened. She looked at the baby again, who was now trying to get comfortable in the jacket. Its spotted fur, having dried a bit, began to show its pattern, and the ear tufts became clearer. "A bobcat kitten?" she repeated, her voice shaking. "Oh, Cy, how did it get here? In the river?" Cy shrugged, feeling anxiety grow in his chest. "I don't know. Maybe it lost its mother. Maybe it was poachers. Hunters sometimes mess around in our woods. Or maybe it just fell from the bank, hungry and weak." Laurie was silent, gazing at the baby. It suddenly reached out to her hand and licked her fingers with a warm tongue. She smiled, despite her worry, and her eyes glistened. "Poor thing," she whispered. "All alone, so small." Cy looked at his wife and felt his heart soften. He knew that look. It was the way Laurie used to look at Duke when he was a puppy. It was the way she looked at the neighbors' children when they came for her pies. It was a look full of love and readiness to protect. "What are we going to do?" he asked, already knowing what she would say. Laurie looked up, and there was determination in her eyes. "Until it gets stronger, we'll keep it here. We'll feed it, warm it up, and then we'll see." Cy nodded, feeling relief. He knew this wasn't an easy decision. It was a promise they were making to each other and to this small creature. He carefully carried the bobcat kitten near the wood stove, where Laurie was already laying out an old blanket. They placed a saucer of warm milk in front of it, and the baby, after a sniff, greedily lapped it up. "It's hungry," Laurie said. Her voice was full of tenderness. "Look how it eats." Cy watched the kitten and thought about how strangely life was arranged. Just an hour ago, he was just a fisherman floating on the river. Now he was a rescuer, holding not just a kitten, but the baby of a wild animal. And although he didn't yet know what awaited them, in that moment he felt that this little one had come into their lives not by chance. It was their small miracle, their new hope. The warmth from the wood stove spread through the room, filling the house with the cozy crackle of burning wood. Silas sat at the table sipping tea, while Lorelei bustled around the stove, preparing dinner. The bobcat kitten, whom they had temporarily settled in a basket near the stove, slept curled up in a ball. Its spotted fur, now dry, softly gleamed in the lamplight. Its tiny paws twitched in its sleep. Cy looked at it and felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and tenderness. "Laurie," he called softly, "come here for a minute. We need to talk." Laurie wiped her hands on her apron and approached. Her gaze immediately fell on the baby. She knelt beside the basket and carefully adjusted the blanket to make the kitten warmer. "Look how it sleeps," she whispered, as if it had been born at home. Cy nodded, but his face was serious. In 40 years of marriage, he had learned to be honest with his wife, especially when it came to important decisions. And this decision, he knew, would be difficult. "Laurie," he began, setting down his cup, "you understand this is not a house cat. It's a wild animal, a bobcat. When it grows up, it won't be like Duke. It's a predator." Laurie looked up, and anxiety flickered in her eyes, but it was immediately replaced by the stubbornness Cy knew so well. "I understand, Cy," she replied. Her voice was soft but firm. "But look at him. He's just a baby, so weak. If we send him away, he'll die. Do you really want that?" Cy sighed, rubbing his forehead. He didn't want that. The very idea of leaving this tiny creature to the mercy of fate was unbearable. But he couldn't stop thinking about the future. What would happen when the bobcat grew up? Could it live in the house? And what would the neighbors say if they found out they had a wild animal in their home? "What if someone sees it?" he asked. The neighbors, the hunters, or, God forbid, the wildlife officials come from the county. They won't allow us to keep a bobcat. They'll take it to a zoo, or worse." Laurie was silent, looking at the baby. It woke up, stretched, and looked at her with its golden eyes. It quietly peeped, as if asking for attention. And Laurie involuntarily smiled. She reached out her hand, and the baby licked her fingers, leaning trustingly into her palm. "Look at him," she said. Her voice trembled. "He trusts us. How can we betray him?" Cy looked at his wife and felt his resolve melting. He knew that look. It was how Laurie looked at their old dog when he was sick. It was how she looked at him when he came home exhausted from work. It was love, pure and selfless, which he could never resist. "All right," he finally said. "While he's little, we'll nurse him, feed him, treat him, and then we'll decide." Laurie nodded, her eyes glistening with tears, but she quickly wiped them away with the corner of her apron. "Thank you, Cy," she whispered. "I knew you wouldn't say no." They leaned over the basket together, gazing at the baby. The bobcat kitten, as if sensing their attention, rolled onto its back, showing its fluffy belly, and quietly purred. Laurie laughed, and Cy shook his head, unable to suppress a smile. "Look at that, a little actor," he said. "He already knows how to charm us." They decided to name him Roo. The name came naturally when he first responded to their voices by lifting his little snout. Laurie brought out an old saucer, poured more milk into it, and Roo greedily drank, making comical smacking sounds. Cy watched this, feeling the anxiety recede, giving way to something new, the hope that this little one would bring something good into their lives. By evening, Laurie had sewn Roo a small cushion from an old sweater, and Cy had brought a wooden box from the shed to make him a shelter. They worked silently but seamlessly, as they always did when they tackled a task together. Roo, full from his meal, climbed into the box and fell asleep, burrowing his face into the cushion. Laurie stood nearby, watching him. Her face glowed with quiet joy. "You know, Cy," she said when they sat down for dinner, "I thought that after Duke we wouldn't have this kind of joy anymore. And now, this little one, it's like someone sent him to us." Cy nodded, feeling her words resonate in his heart. He remembered how empty the house had felt after their dog died, how Laurie cried at night, and he didn't know how to comfort her. Now, looking at the sleeping Roo, he realized that this bobcat kitten was not just a foundling, he was their chance for new warmth, for new love. "Maybe he was sent," he said quietly. "But what do we do with him later, Laurie? He's not a cat. He's going to grow up. What then?" Laurie shrugged, but her eyes were full of certainty. "We'll love him as long as he's with us, and then life will show us the way." Cy looked at his wife and smiled. He knew she was right. They couldn't predict what lay ahead. But in this moment, sitting in their warm kitchen with Roo sleeping by the stove, he felt that their house was alive again. And that simple but profound feeling filled his heart with hope, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Summer in the country bloomed with a riot of colors. The apple trees in Silas and Lorelei's garden were covered in green leaves, and the river that flowed behind their house sparkled under the sun, as if dusted with stars. Roo, the small bobcat kitten rescued from its cold waters, was no longer the weak little bundle that trembled in Cy's jacket. In a few weeks he had grown stronger, bigger, and his spotted fur now gleamed, reflecting the light. His golden eyes sparkled with curiosity, and his movements had become agile, almost graceful. He had become an integral part of their home, their life, and their hearts. Silas and Lorelei adapted to the new occupant with surprising ease. In the morning, when the first rays of sun broke through the curtains, Rue was already waiting at the bedroom door, whimpering and nudging Laurie's feet with his cold nose. She laughed, picking him up, and carried him to the table where a bowl of milk and pieces of chicken, his favorite treat, was waiting. "Just look at you, up before us," she would say, watching him eat greedily. "Just like a child. Everything has to be on time for you." Cy, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, just smiled. Having worked as a maintenance man his whole life, he was used to simple pleasures: the smell of freshly cut grass, Laurie's warm pancakes, the silence of the morning river. But Rue brought something new into their lives, something fiery, alive, almost magical. Despite his wild nature, the bobcat kitten turned out to be surprisingly affectionate. He followed Laurie around the house, as if helping her, sitting nearby when she peeled potatoes or getting underfoot when she hung the laundry. Cy joked that Rue considered himself the boss of the household. "Look, Laurie, he's already sniffing your broom," he'd laugh when the bobcat importantly explored the corner of the shed. "Soon he'll start sweeping the yard for us." Laurie shook her head, but her eyes shone with joy. She, who had always loved animals, hadn't expected a wild creature to be so devoted. Rue sensed her mood. When she was tired, he would climb onto her lap and purr, as if comforting her. When she sang while rolling out dough, he would tilt his head, as if listening. And in the evenings, when the couple sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Rue would settle between them, resting his snout on his paws, and his soft purr would merge with the rustling of the leaves. The neighbors, who were initially suspicious of the exotic pet, gradually got used to him. Vera, who lived 2 houses down, once stopped by for some sugar and froze when she saw Rue playing with a ball of yarn. "Lorelei," she said, pressing a hand to her chest, "is that a bobcat you have? Aren't you afraid?" "He's hardly a bobcat," Laurie replied, smiling. "He's our Rue. Kinder than most cats, honestly." Vera shook her head, but seeing how trustingly the kitten nudged Laurie's hand, she softened. "Well, if he makes you happy, then it's fine," she said. "Just watch out. He's growing. He won't bite, will he?" "He won't bite," Cy firmly replied, walking into the room. "He's smart. He knows who his people are." But there were problems nonetheless. Rue, though affectionate, remained a predator. One day he stole a piece of fish from the neighbor Gary's live well, and Cy had to apologize profusely and pay for the loss. "A predator, after all," he sighed, returning home. "You can't fool the blood." Laurie only laughed, watching Rue, who, with ears down in shame, hid in his box. "It's all right, Cy," she would say. "We'll teach him. He's still a child." They sewed him a new collar out of soft leather to take him for walks by the river. Rue loved these excursions. He would leap over stones, sniff the grass, but he never ran far. Cy looked at him and thought that this little one was more than just an animal. He was their joy, their small miracle, which had filled their home with life. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Laurie rested her head on her husband's shoulder. Rue lay at their feet, purring as if agreeing with the tranquility of the summer evening. "You know, Cy," Laurie said softly, "I thought that after Duke we wouldn't have this kind of closeness again. But Rue, he's like the son we never had." Cy was silent, feeling her words resonate in his heart. He remembered how he and Laurie had dreamed of children, how they felt when fate didn't give them that happiness. Now, looking at Rue, he understood that this bobcat kitten had become their family, not by blood, but by love. "He chose us, Laurie," he said, squeezing her hand, "and we chose him." They sat there until darkness fell, and the stars above the river seemed brighter than usual. Rue, curled up at their feet, quietly snored, and in that sound there was so much peace that Cy felt their home was whole again, and as long as Rue was with them, their hearts would be full of warmth and quiet happiness. Autumn arrived in the country, covering the fields and forests in gold and crimson. The apple trees in Silas and Lorelei's garden dropped their ripe fruit, and the river that flowed behind their house trembled and reflected the bright colors of the foliage. Rue, the bobcat kitten, had turned into a teenager, strong, with long legs and thick spotted fur. His golden eyes still sparkled with childlike curiosity, but something new had appeared in them, a shadow of wild, untamed strength. He was still affectionate, but his movements had become quicker, and his purr sometimes turned into a low, almost growling sound. Silas and Lorelei loved him like their own. In the morning, Rue would wake them up by nudging their cheek with his cold nose, and Laurie would laugh, calling him her alarm clock. During the day, he followed her around the house, watching her make jam or mend old socks. In the evenings, he would settle between the couple on the couch, and his warm fur under their hands was a constant reminder. They are not alone. But with each passing day, Cy noticed signs of Rue's true nature more and more often. He chased birds in the garden, jumped onto high shelves, and once, after catching a mouse, he brought it to the porch, as if proud of his catch. "The predator is growing up," Cy said, looking at the mouse, which he had to dispose of before Laurie saw it. "Laurie, he's not a baby anymore." Laurie nodded, but her eyes were filled with anxiety. She loved Rue like a son, and the thought that he might change frightened her. "He's still ours," she replied, stroking the bobcat who was rubbing against her legs. "His heart is good." One morning, when the first frost covered the grass with rime, Laurie woke up to a strange sound. She looked out the window and froze. Rue was standing at the edge of the woods, lifting his snout to the sky and letting out a long, mournful howl. It wasn't his usual little peep, but a deep, almost wild sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Cy," she called, waking her husband, "listen to him howl." Cy came to the window, listening. There was something ancient, calling in that howl, as if the forest was speaking to Rue in its own language. He looked at his wife and saw the same fear in her eyes that he felt himself. "He's growing up," he said quietly. "He's feeling his blood. The forest is calling him." Rue, as if hearing their voices, turned around. A momentary flash of something wild, unfamiliar, appeared in his eyes. But a second later he was already running toward the house, purring and nudging Laurie's knees with his snout. She knelt down, hugging him, and her face softened. "He's ours, Cy," she said almost pleadingly. "He won't leave, right?" Cy was silent, patting her shoulder. He knew Rue loved them, but he also knew that nature was stronger. He recalled the old hunters' stories about bobcats that returned to the wilderness, even if they were raised among people. What if Rue left one day? Could Laurie survive that loss? And could he? That day, they decided to have a serious talk. They sat at the table while Rue slept in his box, covered with an old blanket. Laurie nervously plucked at the edge of the tablecloth. Her fingers trembled. "I'm scared, Cy," she confessed. I'm scared that he'll grow up and not want to be with us, or that the forest will take him." Cy took her hand, feeling its warmth soothe his own anxieties. "Laurie, we can't keep him by force," he said gently. "He's not a cat, but while he's with us, we'll love him, and if he decides to leave, we'll let him go, for his sake." Laurie nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. She got up, walked to the box, and stroked the sleeping Roo. He stirred, purring in his sleep, and she smiled through her tears. "You won't leave, will you?" she whispered. "You're ours." In the evening, they went out onto the porch, looking at the woods that darkened behind the river. Roo sat beside them. His eyes glistened in the twilight as if reflecting the stars. Cy looked at him and thought about how this little one had changed their lives. He had brought a joy they hadn't expected. But now that joy was tinged with the shadow of fear. What if their love couldn't hold him? What if the call of the wild was stronger? "Cy," Laurie said, squeezing his hand, "no matter what happens, I'm grateful we have him, for every day with him." Cy nodded, feeling her words echo in his heart. He looked at Roo, who was now playing with a dry leaf, tossing it with his paw, and smiled. This bobcat kitten was their miracle, their happiness, their family. And even if the future was unclear, in that moment they were together, and that was the most important thing. October came to the town with cold winds and the golden glow of the forest. The leaves on the apple trees were falling, carpeting the garden in a crimson rug, and the river that flowed behind Silas and Lorelei's house was covered with a thin crust of ice at the edges. Roo, the bobcat, was now almost fully grown, strong, with powerful paws and thick spotted fur that shone like silk. His golden eyes, still full of trust, sometimes flashed with the sparks of his wild nature, reminding them of his roots. But for Cy and Laurie, he remained their Roo, affectionate, devoted, a part of their hearts. The days flowed in their cozy rhythm. In the morning, Roo would meet Laurie in the kitchen, demanding breakfast with his quiet purr. In the afternoon, he would help Cy in the shed, curiously sniffing the tools, and in the evening he would settle on the couch, resting his snout on Laurie's lap. Laurie would stroke him, singing old songs, and her soft, warm voice filled the house with comfort. Cy would look at them and feel his heart swell with gratitude. This bobcat, rescued from the river, had become their joy, their purpose, their family. But on one of those October days, the silence of the town was broken by a disturbing rumor. Neighbors whispered about a bear that had wandered into the surrounding woods. Old hunters shook their heads, saying they hadn't seen such a large animal there in 20 years. Cy, hearing these conversations, just scoffed. He was used to tall tales, but he checked the rifle in the shed just in case. Laurie, upon learning about the bear, frowned but tried not to show her worry. "Cy, just be careful on the river," she said, serving him breakfast. "And don't let Roo wander too far." Cy nodded, petting the bobcat, who sat at his feet, sniffing his old boots. Roo, as if sensing their anxiety, looked at them with his intelligent eyes and quietly purred. Laurie smiled, but a shadow of fear lingered in her heart. That day, Laurie went out to the garden to gather the last of the apples. The air was fresh, smelling of damp earth and fallen leaves. She was humming, placing the ripe fruit in a basket, when she suddenly heard the cracking of branches. She turned around, and her heart stopped. From the bushes that grew near the fence, a bear slowly emerged, huge, with dark fur and a heavy gaze. It stopped, sniffing the air, and Laurie felt her legs give way. "Sigh!" she screamed, but her voice was a strangled sound, and her husband was too far away in the shed to hear. The bear took a step forward, and Laurie froze, not daring to move. Her heart pounded like a drum, and her thoughts were scattered. She knew she shouldn't run, but fear bound her like ice. At that moment, Rue darted out of the house. His fur stood on end, his eyes flashed, and he let out a sound Laurie had never heard before. A low, menacing growl, full of raw power. Rue stood between the bear and Laurie, arching his back and baring his teeth. He was several times smaller, but there was no fear in his posture, only the fierce determination to protect. The bear stopped, looking at the bobcat, and its massive head swayed as if evaluating its opponent. Laurie held her breath, afraid to move. A minute stretched into an eternity, and she thought her heart would burst. Finally, the bear, as if deciding the fight wasn't worth the effort, snorted and slowly turned around. Its heavy steps crackled in the bushes, and soon it disappeared into the woods. Laurie sank to her knees, her hands trembling. Rue, still on guard, turned to her and quietly purred, as if asking if everything was all right. She hugged him, pressing him to her chest, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Rue," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You saved me, my brave boy." Cy, hearing her scream, ran out of the shed, clutching an axe. Seeing his wife hugging Rue and the empty garden, he understood everything. He knelt beside them, embracing them both, feeling his own heart pounding from the terror they had just experienced. "Laurie, are you okay?" he asked. His voice was hoarse. She nodded, not letting go of Rue. "He wouldn't let the bear near me, Cy. Our Rue. He protected us." Cy stroked the bobcat, who was now rubbing his face against his hand. A wild fire still burned in his eyes, but his gaze was full of love. Cy realized that Rue was not just their pet. He was their protector, their family, ready to stand up for them even in the face of danger. In the evening, as they sat by the wood stove, Laurie held Rue on her lap, and Cy looked at them, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "You know, Laurie," he said quietly, "I thought we were saving him. It turns out he was saving us." Laurie smiled, her eyes shining with tears, but they were tears of happiness. "He's ours, Cy, our son." Rue purred, settling in comfortably, and his warm breath was like a promise. He was with them, he loved them, he would protect them. And in that moment, in the cozy light of their home, Silas and Lorelei knew that their life, despite all the fears and doubts, was full of love, genuine, deep, and timeless. Winter wrapped the town in fluffy snow, turning the fields and forests into a snowy kingdom of silence. The river behind Silas and Lorelei's house froze under a thick layer of ice, and the apple trees in the garden stood dressed in silver coats. In the evenings, when the blizzard howled outside the windows, their small house glowed with warm light like a beacon in the night. Rue, their bobcat, was now a grown, graceful creature with powerful paws, magnificent spotted fur, and eyes in which the sparks of wild freedom glittered gold. But for Cy and Laurie, he remained their Rue, affectionate, devoted, their heart. The days flowed in a comfortable rhythm. In the morning, Laurie would wake first, start the wood stove, and prepare Rue's breakfast, a bowl of meat scraps and warm milk. He would meet her at the kitchen door, purring and nudging her hand with his cold nose, as if thanking her for the care. Cy, coming down from the bedroom, would smile, seeing his wife humming while the bobcat sat nearby, tilting his head as if listening to her melody. In the afternoon, Rue would follow Cy to the shed where he fixed tools and importantly sniffed the wood shavings as if checking the quality of the work. In the evenings, he would settle on the old couch between the couple, and his quiet purr would merge with the crackling of wood in the stove. But winter brought more than just comfort. Rumors reached the town about new regulations introduced by the county officials. One of the neighbors, seeing Rue on a walk, reported it to animal control, and soon an inspector arrived at Cy and Laurie's house, a young man in a severe coat carrying a folder of papers. He stood in the living room, looking at Rue, who watched him warily from his box. "Silas Vance, Lorelei Vance," he began, clearing his throat. "You understand that keeping a wild animal at home is illegal? This is a bobcat, a predator. He can be dangerous. His place is in a sanctuary or a zoo." Laurie squeezed her husband's hand under the table. Her face was pale, but her voice remained firm. "He doesn't bother anyone," she said. "He's ours. He's kinder than many people I know." The inspector sighed. His gaze softened, but he shook his head. "I understand that you're attached to him, but he will grow, and his instincts will take over. Think about your safety and the safety of your neighbors." Cy was silent, looking at Rue. He remembered how the bobcat had stood between Laurie and the bear, defending her without fear. Dangerous. Rue was their protector, their family, but the inspector's words struck a chord, planting a shadow of doubt. What if they truly couldn't keep him? What if he became a threat? When the inspector left, promising to return in a week, Laurie sank into a chair, her eyes filled with tears. "Cy, they won't take him, will they?" she whispered. "He's our son." Cy hugged her, feeling his own heart contract. "They won't, Laurie," he said, though he wasn't sure. "We'll figure something out." But that night, as the blizzard howled outside the windows, something happened that changed everything. Rue, usually sleeping soundly in his box, suddenly became agitated. He went to the door, whining mournfully, scratching at it with his paw. Cy and Laurie exchanged glances, feeling anxiety clutch at their chests. "What's wrong, son?" Laurie asked, approaching him. Cy opened the door, and the icy wind hit his face. Outside the threshold, standing in the snowy whiteout, was an adult bobcat. Its fur was covered in frost, but its golden eyes, almost exactly like Rue's, glowed in the darkness. It looked at their house, unmoving, as if waiting. Rue froze. His ears twitched, and his body tensed. "His mother came," Laurie whispered. Her voice shook. "Oh, Cy, that's his mother." Cy was silent, his heart pounding. He watched Rue, who slowly stepped onto the porch. The adult bobcat let out a low, calling sound, and Rue answered quietly, almost uncertainly. There was a conflict in his eyes, the call of blood, the forest, freedom, against the love for the people who had become his family. Laurie pressed against her husband, her fingers squeezing his hand. "Will he leave?" she asked, and there was such pain in her voice that Cy could barely hold back his tears. He stepped toward Rue, knelt down, and placed his hand on the bobcat's head. "Go if you want to," he said softly. "We'll understand. You'll always be ours." Laurie nodded, wiping her tears. "We love you, Rue," she whispered. "And we always will." Rue looked at them. His golden eyes glistened in the moonlight. He took a step toward the woods, toward his mother, who waited in the shadows of the trees. But suddenly he stopped. His gaze darted from the bobcat to the people, and there was such anguish in it that Laurie involuntarily sobbed. Rue stood still for another moment, and then, slowly, as if overcoming an invisible wall, he returned to the porch. He lay down at Cy and Laurie's feet, pressing close to them, and quietly purred. The adult bobcat looked at him. Her eyes flashed for a moment, but she didn't move from the spot. Then, as if accepting his choice, she turned and disappeared into the blizzard, dissolving into the forest. Laurie knelt beside Rue, hugging him. Her tears fell onto his fur. "Thank you, son," she whispered. "Thank you for choosing us." Cy was silent, stroking the bobcat, who was now more than just an animal. He was their family. He felt a warmth spread through his chest despite the cold of the night. This wasn't just an animal's choice. It was love, pure and deep, that had bound them forever. By spring, Rue still woke them up in the mornings, helped Laurie in the garden by running after her with curiosity, and went fishing with Cy, sitting on the bank and watching the bobber. The neighbors, having learned of his feat with the bear, were no longer afraid. Rue became a local legend, a big cat that the children adored and the adults respected. Even the county officials, upon their return, softened when they saw how devoted the bobcat was to his people and settled for a warning. Silas and Lorelei thanked fate every day for that morning on the river. They hadn't just rescued a kitten, they had gained a son who taught them that love knows no bounds. Their home, their hearts, their lives were full of warmth, and as long as Rue was with them, they knew their family was not about blood, but a choice made by the heart.